Good afternoon and welcome to our December Institute for Health Policy Studies Health Policy Grand Rounds. We are very excited to have with us today Michelle Coe. She is an alum of the IHPS Fellowship Program and is now an associate professor in the Division of Health Policy and Management in the Department of Public Health Sciences at University of California, Davis. She previously completed that postdoc at IHPS after getting her doctorate at UCLA. Her research examines the intersections of social structural inequities, particularly structural and institutional racism, and health systems, and policy. Her current main areas of research include the impact of exposures to structural racism, particularly community violence and law enforcement over the life course, and how those things impact aging and cognitive health among African American older adults. She also is looking at how institutional racism manifests in academic medical institutions and educational processes. Her past projects cover a whole range of areas that I will not get into in detail, but I do want to make a bit of a plug. This is the Institute's 50th anniversary, and we have been involved in training fellows in clinical fields and social sciences through our interdisciplinary programs now since our inception as an organization. It was one of the things that our founders, Phil Lee and Lou Butler, both agreed was one of the most important things IHPS ever did. We are in the process of raising funds to fully endow our fellowship fund in celebration of our 50th anniversary and in honor of our founders, Phil and Lou. So if you have any interest and opportunity as in your end of year giving to support our fellowship fund, you can go on our website, which is healthpolicy.ucsf.edu. And that supports our future provocative fellows such as Michelle. And what I say about provocative is the title of her talk is my medical school racist? Yes. So welcome, Michelle. I'm handing the mic over to you.
Thank you again, Joanne and IHPS so much for the invitation to speak. Certainly as a former postdoc, it really is amazing privilege to come back. And moreover, I do want to be clear that it was also amazing privilege that Joanne offered me the opportunity to speak about whatever I want. And so it's in no way anyone else's fault about the title of the talk, except for mine. But we're going to talk about something that I have been thinking about probably for my entire career, which is how your, and everyone's medical school is racist. And yes, we know up front, they are. Okay. All right, so since I already gave you the answer in the title, what are we doing here for an hour? And first, we're going to have some grounding assumptions. One, I'm assuming that everyone knows what racism is. Two, we're really not in the business of pretending it doesn't happen in medicine. This is not going to be a talk, trying to prove to you that racism exists. We're going to assume that it does. But three, really that some people, and maybe not everyone, but I think there really are a lot of people who are genuinely interested in change. And so under those assumptions, my goal for this talk is to really introduce some theories around racism in institutions like medical schools, a couple illustrations of institutional racism from my own studies. And then the idea is that you come away from this with specific ways to think about how racism operates at your own institution and what you can do about it, how you go about it to changing those things. Okay, so what's next? All right. So this is my kids. Anyone have kids been on a car ride that's either 5 minutes or 6 hours? It's always the same. And this is also, when you're in medical school, this is also leadership talking to any DEI leader. It is really the urgency of white supremacy culture. And so we want to name that and call that out because really we're talking about entrenched processes that really span generations. So for example, on the left here, this is a quote from Henry Gibbons, who was the president of the California Medical Society in 1858. And to point out, we've been talking about diversity for a long time in medicine, even in California. And as a side note, he is talking about a very contentious conflict between Hugh Tolland and Beverly Cole, who are the key founders of our own University of California medical schools. And he was talking about an argument they had amongst other white men. So 1858 to now, I just put this in. So thanks to your patience at IHPHS for having the slides only done just a minute. Yesterday, AAMC made a new press release. Our medical schools are more diverse than ever. The percentage of Black students entering into medicine went from 9 to 10% this year. And then I did just want to put in the PS, the caveat, the total number of matriculants, when you look in the detailed tables, the number who actually identify as Black went down from 2045 to 2085. So that is great to celebrate the percentage. But I have a question about where did the other 260 go? Why are we not having a continuous progress upward? Okay. So one of the hallmarks of racism, as we're saying, is the continuous reproduction, time and time again. That's also why we consider racism as a fundamental cause in public health. And so specifically today, and we'll get back to the area of admissions because we're really talking about, as I said, is institutional racism. So also to ground us, on the right is a photo of the new UCA affiliated colleges when they were being built in 1897. On the left, a quote about how on request, the state prison director supplied granite quarried by prisoners of Folsom at a saving of $10,000. So kind of reminding us that there are structural elements of racism, inequity, incarceration from the foundings of our own institutions. The other piece that I did want to put in here about the history of not just UCSF, but really when we think of California medical schools, right? When we think about the Flexner Revolution, there's a lot of documentation about how that was really used as a mechanism and a source for, stripping Black entry into medical schools, shutting down Black medical schools. I want to point out in California, another priority at the time was really to make sure that aspiring physicians of Chinese descent were barred from entering medical school. And you could see that in the original UC changes in its rules. They were requiring all successful applicants to have 2 years of college. And not only did you have to take biology and chemistry, you also had to take English, French, or German in order to be eligible for medical school at the new University of California School of Medicine. Okay, so, however, as your own UCSF presidential scholar recently, Kamara Jones, has now gone sadly, but she's taught many people of our generation now that institutionalized racism involves the way in which resources, privileges, and goods are racialized in their allocation. This is not just a feature of the past, it is a feature of the present. So on the right, in 2000, she had a canonical publication, Levels of Racism, A Gardener's Tale, where she explains institutionalized racism, and she used the allegory of a gardener and a garden in which institutionalized racism is represented by what you put inside these planters. Does it have rocks or does it have nutrients? What are the conditions that enable some flowers to thrive and others to not? And that we need to pay attention to those conditions, not just the characteristics of those flowers. And so medical schools are those planters. And in her article, she also questioned, who is the gardener? Who is making the decision about what goes into the planter? And again, medical schools are also the gardeners. So today we're going to kind of go the next level deeper, right? This is our allegory where we're starting from medical schools as a mechanism of institutional racism. I want to get to the next level of theory and talk about that. Who are the gardeners? How are they making decisions? And what are they doing? I'm going to draw on two general theoretical areas. And so here's your warning right now. This talk is going to be a lot of theory. And I'm emphasizing theory really over methods because I think the academic medicine enterprise has a general tendency to do that. We skip over theory, we go right to the design, we go right to the methods, and we want to start criticizing that. So let's pull back a bit, because I think really under-theorized, under-conceptualized research is how we end up with bad research. So bear with me. First, we're going to talk about racialized organization theory, which was introduced by sociologist Victor Ray, and then subsequently elaborated on in his discussion with racialized administrative burdens and applied to medical schools. And then we're going to talk about diversity regimes. This is a term coined by James Thomas, but he very importantly cites foundations from feminist scholars and others in sociology. And a diversity regime is really describing the way in which diversity work itself becomes a way to deflect or even counter efforts to dismantle institutional racism. Okay, so I'm going to explain each of these a little bit in more detail, and then I'm going to provide 2 illustrations from qualitative studies to give more specificity. Okay, so what is racialized organization theory? In 2019, Victor Ray proposed that organizations are the means by which we produce institutionalized racism. Dr. Jones says institutionalized racism is how we differentially allocate goods, resources, and services by race. Ray is arguing that organizations are the ones that do the work of this, how they operate, and the tenets of racialized organization theory are that, 1, racialized organizations determine the relative agency of racialized groups, who has power, who doesn't have power, and it is set by the organization. Organizations are the ways and determine how resources are allocated. That thirdly, organizations put in place formal rules and procedures, and the formal rules and procedures are seemingly race neutral on their face. And then they are designed to racialize allocation or part of the aspect of when those rules go into place or not. And underpinning all of this is whiteness as a credential. Whiteness is the credential which chooses who gets preferential allocation for the resources, how the formal procedures and rules are designed, or when it's time to relax those procedures and rules in favor, again, by those credentialed as white. Okay, so following the Ray's publication, 2 people, and I apologize if I mispronounce this, but Max Jordan and Gomani Tiako, who's a resident currently, and Eugenia South is a faculty member at University of Pennsylvania. They collaborated with Victor Ray to put out 2 publications explaining how medical schools are racialized organizations. They walk through Ray's theories and then provide the examples that we have so far in the literature from medical schools. So we see agency of racial groups differentially in the learning climate. So for example, a very structured piece is that because we have more diversity in schools of medicine amongst the students and not the faculty, there becomes differential agency in place by people of color. Medical schools allocate resources in racialized ways, whether or not it's spots in the medical school, or as we see, who gets awards, who is elected to AUA, who is given honors. And then thirdly, another piece is certainly the application of the rules and procedures. And again, admissions, what aspects of admissions end up having racialized advantages or not, and assessment. So for example, actually here at UC Davis, we took a number of lessons from UCSF in examining and identifying racial inequities in clerkship grading. And then ultimately leading to the elimination of honors in core clerkships, because that honors process ended up with racial inequities. And again, to the disproportionate advantage of white medical students. Okay. So medical schools as racialized organizations. The next piece is within that. One of the things that organizations do is they create administrative burdens. Victor Ray collaborated with political scientists Pamela Hurd and Don Moynihan, and they had developed this theory of administrative burdens, the idea that the minutiae of administrative process burden those with the least power, that this is a feature and not a bug of administrative systems. And, they further discuss under racialized administrative burdens that these small processes have large effects on access to resources. The burdens fall on those with the least power, who are people of color, and the burdens are built into the policies. And then they explain that these burdens have costs, particularly for people of color, learning costs, compliance costs, and psychological costs. And I'll explain those in just the next slide. But one of their examples that they use is really voter suppression, how voting rules, procedures, and administrative processes are used to suppress people's ability to vote. And one of the examples that's frequently in the news is really these long lines, the documentation hurdles, and so on that people have to overcome in order to vote in Georgia, and how this is a way of suppressing the Black vote. Okay, so where do we see racialized administrative burdens in medical schools? So very common example, as Hurd and Moynihan talk about, also racialized burdens in applying for safety net programs and public assistance. We see the same thing with, for example, fee assistance, right? There's learning costs. So learning costs are the time and energy it takes to figure out how are you going to apply, even learning about the program. And then what does it take to apply for it? There are compliance costs. What documents do I need to submit a fee waiver? How do I appeal a denial of my fee waiver? I had, one of my former students whose ability to take the MCAT was delayed for almost a year because of their repeat interactions with AMCAS in terms of having the right documentation, and that seemingly, as I think is really what you see across many systems, seemingly arbitrary changes. This is the right paperwork, that is not the right paperwork. And again, this disproportionately falls on students of color due to the conditions of structural racism. And then this all leads to psychological costs, anger, frustration, increased stress. And again, so here are the consequences of racialized administrative burdens, and we have them all over the place in medical school. Okay. So I'm going to pivot just a little bit to another conceptual bucket, but is relevant for, again, when we talk about racism in medical schools. So in 2020, another sociologist of higher education, James Thomas, he published an extensive ethnography of one university. And drawing from the work of other scholars, he developed what he calls diversity regimes. And in short, all the ways in which higher education institutions construct diversity operations, and the way they construct diversity operations to actually undermine racial progress and maintain the appearance of racial progress. So he draws heavily from a feminist scholar, Sarah Ahmed, who interviewed diversity leaders in the UK over a decade ago. And she has argued we have to call diversity work, instead we should call it performative, really non-performative, because it's performing. In her interviews, what came out was it was performing nothing. And the importance of diversity ultimately was to make an organization look good, or rather diversity work. Let's clarify that. Okay, so Thomas describes a number of process for how this happens. First one is called flattening, and it is the idea that the university says diversity is everywhere. Everyone has diversity in their mission. Everyone has to receive diversity training, and there is diversity everywhere. And ultimately, no one is then held accountable anywhere. The second process he describes is called condensation, how everything is condensed into diversity. Racial and ethnic groups are diversity. Sexual orientation, gender minorities are diversity. Religious diversity, so on. So is disability and everything. And essentially, when diversity can mean anything, ultimately it means nothing. Third, he talked about decentralization, where the work of diversity is just distributed willy-nilly across the campus. There is no organization, there's no coordination. People are replicating work, and it makes it also easier to have no accountability. The next piece is called staging difference. And this I'll talk about more in detail with one of the studies, but it is in general how institutions expect people of color to be leaders and managers of diversity work. They are constantly pushing for new programs led by leaders of color and use these new programs and these leaders of color as evidence for the university's commitment to diversity. He draws back on what Sarah Ahmed says is these leaders end up being the embodiment of diversity for the university. And then the other last piece, which Thomas references, is earlier work done by education scholar Ellen Berry, who looked at, sort of the rise of diversity language in higher education. And she talks about this process of selective inclusion. And this is relevant to admissions, where universities position themselves to admit certain minorities, demonstrate they're doing diversity without putting forth any structural changes in the underlying processes. And they don't change their underlying admissions processes because they want to also still be able to maintain what they think of as institutional prestige. Okay, so I know that was a lot. It was a lot of ideas. But I was going to say, does any of it sound familiar to you? And does anyone feel any light bulbs of recognition? Because that's how I felt when I was reading this book, that what I like about theory is it gives names and forms to what we know and what we see. And so very quick examples: flattening. When everybody in your medical school, the departments, the units, the centers, everyone has a mission statement that says something about diversity. Condensation, the LCME has diversity accreditation standards, as well as ACGME, and the LCME is like, okay, you choose what's going to be in diversity. It could be anything, you just have to choose it and define it. Decentralization, kind of with the flattening, and we'll talk about this more. There's got on any campus, including, your own, my own, there's an Office of Diversity and Outreach. We've also got an anti-racism, initiative. We've also got departmental diversity committees. It's all over the place. Okay, staging difference. This is something I actually benefited from myself. There used to be at our campus these continuous funding opportunities where they're like, we want new innovations in diversity, new initiatives. It's always about, in general in medicine, right? It's always about the shiny, the new, the disruptive. But we want the people of color to do it, and it still has to be new. We won't put money into it if it's already old, if it's already in existence. And then we'll get to selective inclusion in medical school admissions. Okay. So this is a quote from my own partner. This was late 2020. This was in the very long process of trying to eliminate race from our GFR calculations at UC Davis Health. And this is, of course, happening after every institution declares a commitment to anti-racism, right? And I just want to bring this up because though these changes were the fruit of really important leadership by Vanessa Grubbs and others, it really comes down to the nitty-gritty work inside an organization to make it happen. It is a grind to undo institutionalized racism, and especially because we are seeing how it permeates everywhere within an organization. So, okay. We are halfway through the talk. Thank you if you are still here. I am finally going to get to some research. Okay, so the first piece, when I was a medical student in the Drew UCLA program, and I don't know if we mentioned that, but before I did my PhD, I was a medical student, and we were required to complete a scholarly project related to health disparities. And so back in 2001, I decided I wanted to study diversity in medicine, because that was what I experienced in medical school. And I knew that it was really different. It was very different from almost any other medical education people are having, unless you're at another HBCU. And I was doing literature review, and I found out people have been studying this for a long time. Here's a study of class in 1975, published in 85, a discussion of another diversity initiative called Project 3000 by 1994. Another paper published in 1996, specifically on Black and Hispanic physician practice locations in California. And ultimately, I emailed one of these authors and asked if he would mentor me on this project. And that person was Kevin Grumbach, in family medicine at UCSF. And For anyone who's in training out there, I always encourage you to just cold call people, because you never know if they will in fact say, yeah, sure, I'll mentor you. And when we went on to study the outcomes of the DREW program, we published some papers. We were doing this in the context of understanding already from Tim Reddy at AAOC, saying from Project 3000 by 2000, he felt like schools were kind of skeptical and pulling away. But they had UC Prime programs took off. I went on to study other things in my dissertation and postdoctoral work. And so 20 years later, guess what? Everyone is still talking about all the problems I talked about in 2010, in 2000s, 1990s, 1980s, 1600s, pick your time period. The policies have come and gone, the initiatives have come and gone. You know, the number of men who identified as Black only entering medical school in 2019, that was 619 men. And last year was 813. This year it's 671. So I'm not sure anyone is really ready to declare success, or they shouldn't be. And so my question was really, you know, what is going on? I'm not really interested in running another analysis of data, putting out more numbers. It was really time to get qualitative. So very quickly, we interviewed 39 deans and directors of US medical schools from November 2019 to March of 2020. Had no idea there was going to be a pandemic. This was before George Floyd. And at the time, we were just asking them, you know, how's it going in admissions? What do you do? Halfway through the conversation, we say, well, you know, so what do you think about diversity? How do you define it? How is that going? All right. And I will just give snippets of some of the findings. So first of all, you know, when we ask people, you know, what does diversity mean? What does it mean when you're trying to implement it in admissions? Diversity meant everything. As we mentioned earlier on flattening, same thing with our admissions leadership. As I have here, one person said, it's diversity of human beings. They would start out with saying race, ethnicity, but everything else followed. Gender, religion, location. Did you play sports in college? Were you in the military? This is all diversity. And this was pretty consistent across the board. Everyone did this. There were just a few who said, I'm a little concerned. I'm a little concerned that we keep talking about diversity and we're not really looking at historical issues of racial discrimination. And other people saying, ultimately, though, I don't really know what it is. I don't know how we're defining it. I'm not really sure how we get there. I know we're not there yet. So then when we asked them, you know, how's it going? And they named some challenges. We have a couple of themes from that, but certainly illustrating the, they said part of it is our leadership. Leadership is really not committed. They are just really interested in looking good on paper. A lot of pressure from leadership to emphasize the MCAT more than they wanted to. Even beyond, you know, what they thought about the MCAT, it became, look, we have to get those numbers. We have to get those numbers just right. The subtext was that it's very hard to change a lot of your other factors on your US News and World Report score, but MCATs, you have control over that. You have control over the median MCAT of your entering class. And then there's, you know, pressure from alumni, faculty. So here's a quote. Someone had mentioned that they had had a predecessor who was really successful in diversifying their class and really made big change. And there was a white coat ceremony and they got a lot of pushback from faculty, pushback from alumni, with directly this quote, what happened to our 6'2" blonde white men? Where are they? Where did they go? So even when people have a leadership position in admissions, part of the emphasis is that they're still within an organization and there are other actors in the organization who are giving pressure on them. Okay. We also happen to try to recruit participants from schools across a range of student racial composition. And we found some difference in findings of the experiences of those who worked in a lower diversity school versus those who worked in a higher diversity school. People in the lower diversity school, really for them, their number one stressor is competition. They're competing for students. That increasingly they need scholarship money. They may or may not have it. And so this is what one person was saying is like, I feel like I'm buying a student. Another person had said, I feel like I really have to bribe someone to come here. In converse, schools with high diversity, we didn't talk to them exactly why necessarily, but certainly they may have more scholarship funds, they may have other processes that they put into place. But what their challenges were different context. Their context was really, they're bringing in students, there's a lot of diversity in their admissions, and then they're bringing them into a hostile environment, and that is their main challenge. When they bring students in, the learning climate is very harsh, and then the students are coming to them, the students are upset, and then also it is negatively impacting their recruitment. Students know, and they will talk to pre-meds. And so there is, I think, an important lesson here about what they're talking about in terms of they need help from the entire institution. It is not sufficient to have just admissions doing it. We also asked specifically about LCME accreditation standards for diversity and what their approach was, how admissions was involved, and what was the effect of that. And on the one hand, people had said it was helpful. It was really helpful to have this new standard in because it made their leadership take the issue more seriously and get them motivated and give them a little bit of support. And on the other hand, they said, though it was helpful, but others have said up to a point, because the institution decides what's going to consider diversity. And so we had one leader who had worked very hard to improve their Native American, American Indian representation in their medical class. I felt quite proud of it, but was given sort of the message from above. Okay, but we are not going to include it in our accomplishments. We're not going to include it in our standard because we're not going to be able to achieve this with faculty. We have no faculty, Native faculty, so we are not including this in our accounting to the LCME. So it ends up being somewhat down leveling too. Okay. So where are we coming back to our theory? What is going on? Medical schools are racialized organizations. They have formal rules and procedures. By the way, that leader who drastically increased the diversity of his class and the alumni and faculty got upset, and that person was pushed out of their position. We were talking to their successor who was trying to figure out how to navigate this history. There were also more overt findings that I don't have quotes as many for here, but really how they themselves, even when they wanted to be interested in diversity, still put different processes in place. People who had social and political connections to the university, for example, got automatically granted interviews or preferences on the wait list. Everyone would say, oh, this isn't my final decision. It doesn't affect my final decision. But the truth is we're still bending rules and procedures and allocating resources with whiteness as a credential. Then we have selective inclusion. So again, the schools are focusing on admitting some minority students, so as long as they don't jeopardize their overall process to maintain their US News and World Report rankings. We see flattening and condensation. Everyone said, we all talk about diversity. Diversity is everywhere. And that's sort of the condensation. And as you saw, they all said, oh, diversity means all of this, diversity of thought. But also the flattening part was in part some frustration because they knew it. They saw it happening where everywhere in the school is supposed to be talking about diversity, and they felt very much like we're the only ones doing it. For the most part, we had a few people who were in a good place where it was like, it's not just us. But a lot of others were the only ones doing diversity truly. Curriculum isn't doing it. Faculty is not doing it. So thinking through step by step, how have we institutionalized racism? Okay, So doing this study led to another study because after that we had so many questions. A couple of participants had mentioned that they worked with their school's DEI leadership, or they had tried to, and this was late 2020 and early 2021. And at that point, everyone is declaring how anti-racist they are. It seemed like every day there was a new statement declaring the anti-racism. There were a lot of new DEI positions created and centers and initiatives. And UC Davis, UC lower right hand corner, we even published our own student-led racial justice report card, which showed that our representation is an A and our faculty representation is a C, which maybe is even higher than some of us expected. And so I really want to credit two of our medical students, Maya London, who's now an MS2, who started with this question, and Caitlin Esparza, who was one of the leaders on the racial justice report card, and has really taken this study through in terms of the analysis and is writing up the manuscript on it. And so it's the same thing. What's going on? And we decided to interview people. We started out recruiting people who were leaders of offices of DEI or centers. And unlike admissions, there's no standard for this. You can have any sort of position, and you can have any sort of title with some word of diversity or equity, inclusion, justice in any order. Same thing, we're asking, how's it going? What is your title? What do you have? What are you expected to do? What do you actually do? Okay. So some key themes. First of all, as I alluded to, really wide variability in the scope, in the time allocation, and the resources. So as Caitlin put together one example, there are a number of people who their title was Associate Dean of DEI or EDI or something like that. We had, whether or not they're called Associate Dean, the range of scope was all over the map. Some people focused just on students. Some people focused on faculty. Some did GME. Some did all of them. They were all the Associate Dean of DEI, but their responsibility within the School of Medicine could be anything. Their time allocation, some had 20%, some had 65%, some had 0, even though, again, they're all associate deans. Staff, budgeting, 0 staff, 3 or more FTEs. Budget, no budget, full formal budget, sustained budget, dedicated programming and funding, again, all over the place. There was just a continuous, and sort of this variability reflects the second part. There's really not, there's a mismatch between what the institution invested and then the directives that they were given. And so we have some quotes here around they want us to collect data. They want us to make recommendations or mandates. The dean's office is saying, okay, we told you last year, how come you didn't do it? And they're saying, well, we didn't give it. You didn't give me any staff. You didn't give me any resources. How are we supposed to make that happen? And then another point is that they're given directives for areas and units of which they don't actually have responsibility. The DEI office is constructed in parallel on the side of something else, on the side of medical education, on the side of faculty development. And so this is what they mean by their powers by proxy. There's something you're recommended to do. You have to somehow move the person who has actual authority to do it. And then that becomes a mismatch between what the institution says you're supposed to do and what they can actually do. There was really no one using any evidence base, any change framework, theories, and there were no standards for expertise. And we talked to people who have been, as we have here, someone doing it for 20 years, 40 years, 0, and then 0 years, and talking about both no one knows how to do it, and that it's not as if medical training actually teaches you how to do this. In putting this theme, Caitlin had said, isn't there some field called implementation science? And I said, oh yeah, there is. No one brought that up. No one brought working with their implementation science colleagues to talk about how are we going to implement DEI in our institution. It is very much, we're giving someone a title. Hooray, we have a title. Stuff is supposed to happen, and we announce it. This is sort of the leadership logic model as far as we can see from what actually happens. Okay, and then those who are doing it, They're both driven and really motivated by their personal experiences most often, and hugely exhausting. One person says, my job is to have hope. My job is to be there, absorb everything for everyone else. And they talk about how they're supposed to do this. They're the person who's supposed to do all the healing for the school, for everyone in it, and then have no time for healing themselves. And I put this photo up here as a reference to Sherman James. He developed the concept of John Henryism in the 1970s. It's about how African Americans will develop really high coping, high effort mechanisms to control their environment through superhuman performance. And the parallel to that is Cheryl Woods Giscombe describes Superwoman schema, which is development off of Black feminist thought on strong Black women. And again, the high effort of coping in harm in racialized, under-resourced environments, that some of this high effort coping can be beneficial, but only in the context of adequate supports and resources. So I think one of the things we need to think a lot about is the people who we put in these positions. Are we really ultimately shortening their lives by asking this work of them? Okay, so kind of circling back, how is racism showing up in our flagship DEI anti-racist programs? Certainly allocation of resources, right? Who gets funding, who gets staff, who gets budgets, and faculty wellness, maybe, but does your DEI office? Maybe not. Formal rules and procedures. Other units have structure, organization, and they're legitimized within the power hierarchy of the medical school. DEI is left out of it and can be disempowered. Administrative burdens. So when we mentioned that some people have staff and budget and others don't, and others do, but only after really being shunted through long processes and procedures, or being told you can get it if you get their own grants. A really glaring example of administrative burden was, we had one participant who got 2 requests in 1 week. One was, can you hold a session to discuss George Floyd with the medical students next week? 2, can you please complete all this documentation to justify the existence of your position, why you should have it? So we're neglecting administrative burdens, not just on, say, medical students, but really even on our own leadership. And because they are mostly people of color, these all become racialized. Okay, as well as then here, there's a lot of staging difference. The DEI leaders are really embodying schools diversity. It's really taking the toll on them. They're highly motivated, but really in the absence of structural change, they're burned out. And decentralization. DEI is all over the place. As we had said earlier, you could be anywhere within the hierarchy. You could be in the Office of Medical Education. You could be in faculty development. You could be a separate dean reporting directly to the executive dean. These are all ways, by lack of coordination, to get things not done. Okay, so yeah, I talk about this all the time, right? What do we do now? Why am I just all I do is keep talking about racism? Okay, so that's okay. We're going to move though. We'll move to what is real anti-racist practice. What is a critical self-reflection, critical self-evaluation? We understand racism in the foundation, the pillars, the walls, the ceilings of everywhere in academic medicine. We need to reflect on it. We need to really interrogate it in detail. But the good news is, if racism is everywhere, then the opportunities for change are also everywhere. If it's in your pillars, your walls, your ceilings, your foundation, that means every piece of it is an opportunity for change. And I did want to put out PS. Listen to your students when they start to bring up issues up front. You don't have to wait until they go on strike. That not paying your students a living wage is also a way of meeting out institutional racism. Okay, so believe it or not, in these studies, we did ask people about how are you overcoming these challenges. It's not all barrier. And as we talked about the things that they were doing, the things they were trying, we kind of came up with some categories of strategies. The first one is change the story of what you're doing. This is sort of within anti-racist practice of narrative change. Change the processes. Got a little bit already, we talked about processes. Change the people. Who are the people there? Change the organization as a whole. And then sort of especially when we talk to DEI leaders, the conclusions are coming out of are the importance of building community and organizing. So concrete examples, changing the stories. One person we talked to said what they really invested in was changing the mindset of their leadership, of saying admissions is selecting the students, but it's the job of the school to educate them. As we mentioned earlier, in some places, what happens if students have academic challenges, it turns around and everyone blames admissions. And they only blame admissions when students of color struggle. So changing the narrative, reorient everyone, saying, no, a lot of people are qualified. Our job is to be better educators and to educate them in the way they is best for them. Another one, don't sell your institution's value by US News and World Report. Really take pride in other things. Show the values of your institution, not national rankings. This is what you need to do when going to development. Changing the process. This is one where folks alluded to, we did not push them on it, but really one fundamental process is to stop screening by MCAT scores. One of the ways in which schools perpetuate a process of institutional racism is saying we're just trying to aim for the MCAT score we had last year, every year, always trying to get the same MCAT score. But that, just stop doing that. Use a different way of screening. You can, of which there have been published many ways to screen your applications. Another DEI leader said one thing that made them really effective was they convinced the dean that the chairs have to be evaluated and they have to be accountable to their DEI progress. And so within their annual review, that was a criterion for department chair performance. Changing the people. A number of our participants, when they wanted more diversity in admissions, they did a number of things. They reconstituted the entire admissions committee in one case, or they cut it back, or in one case, someone really increased the size of it because there are people they couldn't get rid of, so they diluted their power. Another one is remove obstructionists from positions of power. I think one of the challenges we hear often is like, oh, you can't do that. But all the evidence we have about how many people who try to advance diversity get fired or pushed out, we know you can in fact remove people. And that's what has to happen ultimately. Some people have to be removed, demoted, or pushed out. Changing the organization. Another thing that was very helpful was changing the reporting structure. Having your admissions leader report directly to the dean. This would help shield them from complaints by the faculty, for example. Same thing with your DEI leaderships. If they can report directly to the dean rather than dean of medical education. But really I want to focus, I think going forward on the last two is building community. One of the things we've thought about a lot that I haven't gone so far in the research side is within, if you do have a DEI position, instead of, and oftentimes people have the chance to shape what they're going to do. Instead of running around doing crisis response management for your school, being the one who does all the apologies for when someone else makes a mistake, spend the time to identify, convene your allies, build relationships, figure out who is actually committed to the work. And that enables people to then organize collectively. And so some of the areas where we can see real institutional change that can happen is when we have the collective organization and action of many interested parties within the medical school. So on that note, I am ending with a quote from my parents. I'm originally from Delaware, but my parents are from Taiwan. And they were lifelong and still are lifelong organizers and activists for independence and democracy in Taiwan. And this is my childhood. It was community organizing every weekend. That was our family hobby. But in their lifetime, they, to their credit, they got to be part of moving from authoritarian government and martial law to democracy. So I always try to draw from that as inspiration and thinking through, there's a lot we can do. There's always something else that we can do more. So thanks so much again to all our study participants, again to Caitlin Esparza, Mark Simon, who did all the interviewing leads, Mark Henderson, who was really instrumental in getting admissions leaders to talk to us, Maya London, who worked on both studies, Tanya Fancher, who through UC Davis Center of Diverse Health Workforce provided the funding for these studies, Erica Bath at UCLA as our collaborator on the DEI officers study, Rachel Hardman was a collaborator and longtime friend on the admission study. Participants again, can always keep thanking them, and HRSA for providing the funding. Okay, so thanks very much, and we'll take it away, Joanne. Any questions?
Great. And you can stop sharing your screen so everybody can see you. Wonderful. So we have a space in the Q&A box, and anybody who would like to ask questions can do so. We've got about 5 or 10 minutes available for Q&A. There are so many provocative layers in what you presented. And I have to say that one of the things that struck me was not so much a question, but just an observation that this has largely been the same problem for 30 years, at least. I mean, that's kind of my memory time of it, including your observation about how we treat individuals who have been accepted or perceived to have been accepted through shifts in admission policies that are aimed to bring in individuals who are more diverse. Or even if not intentionally more diverse, it is a kind of a side effect of a change that might be focused on other domains, and diversity is part of what comes of that. As an undergraduate, I was in an unusually large class of women at MIT. It was a big jump from about 25% to 38%. And I spent 4 years with, oh, you're in that class, as if I were not qualified to have been there on my own merits. And similar comments were made about choice of specialty, which we see in medicine frequently. As well as the subsequent class had a larger than kind of usual percentage of people of color in it, non-Asian, specifically Black and Hispanic, and many individuals I knew in that cohort got the same thing. So 30 years later, it's disheartening how much progress we still have to make, and how much people's underlying stereotypes and that are absorbed then by individuals then get reflected in this, because it undermines one's own confidence, regardless of whether an individual was admitted in their full merit. And merit is a problematic term. So we have a question for Mara Decker, who thanks you for this pragmatic and fantastic talk. And it says a related topic to commitment to diversity and equity is who the school is serving. How is the school working with their local community, and who gets covered? Did this come up in your research?
So yes, thank you for that question. It's a great question, and something that we also thought was interesting as observers. So on the admission study one person mentioned that they deliberately included community members on their admissions committee. A few included them as their interviewers, but it was rare. And sometimes it wasn't always clear how community members got selected. I feel like only one of them was very explicit and intentional of, we are serving and where we are located. And this is a predominantly, in this case, it was a school with a predominantly Black, urban, generally underserved community. And their intention was to change that by putting community members in their admissions process. And they were in an unusual place too, because they also were working hand in hand with their curriculum. But that's what it takes. They work hand in hand with the curriculum leadership as well to make the curriculum better tailored to the actual community that's there. Same thing with the DEI officers. We had a couple who their job was, we had said spans everything. Some of them, their job was to develop community partnerships. And oversee community partnerships with the school. But again, it feels very much like a lot of the times it is something in parallel. They are given space as a side structure. And we are not seeing the point where, say, that's great, develop a community partnership. Let's integrate that into our regular day of business. Let's integrate that into our accountability structures. We are not seeing a lot of that there. And part of it is because really to develop good community relationships, you need to put in staff and you need to have budget and you need to have money for the community members. So not yet. We're not seeing that much of it. There's the AAMC Group on Diversity and Inclusion had done a survey of DEI leaders in the last year. And so we are looking forward to seeing the results of that. We haven't seen that come out yet to give us some, sort of the quantitative picture and to go with the qualitative piece.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question. Frequently concerns about diversity in the healthcare professions gets kicked down to the pipeline issue. And that becomes a bit of a, well, we can't solve K through 12 education and we can't solve college, processes. And we're stuck with the applicant pool that we have. So what else are we supposed to do?
Well, I think the first part of that premise is something that's always bothered me, and that's what motivated me to do this research, is when I was a medical student. So 20 years ago, Joanne, talking about time passage, I was on the admissions committee for Drew. And then I did admissions for UCLA Prime. And so those experiences showed me we have plenty of applicants. We actually really, as everyone likes to devolve responsibility down through K through 12 or four-year college. But the reality is that we have a lot of applicants, and it just depends on what you think is important and what your school thinks is important. So that's one part, right? Like we're saying, there are two things that really screen out people: the screening by the MCAT score that you had last year, or screening for the maximal MCAT score you can have, even though we don't think that actually matters that much. There's really a floor to how much that actually matters. So when people say they're not people qualified, what do you mean? The other piece where we screen out is supplemental application. This is a small one, but this is what I mean. Every little process has a piece. Supplemental applications. Some schools automatically send out supplementals to everyone. That's going to weed out a lot of people who they hit their fee waiver limit, or it's a whole nother process to get a fee waiver to do that one. So do we really not have enough qualified applicants? Is one problem. Is who's deciding what's qualified. The second piece is when we talk about, the high diversity schools, one of the things they're doing is they're just building their own pipeline, or rather pathway programs. This is a change in our language of time, but it's just build your own pathway program. Everyone has a local community from which you could be drawing more medical students. And so that's what we see the schools with higher diversity doing. They're investing in just making the program themselves. And then the lower diversity ones seem to still be pulling at the edges of competition and scholarships.
Yeah.
So maybe not to Mara's question about community, we see more, maybe it's more that partnership with your universities, your community colleges, your HBCUs, in making those partnerships more formalized. I think so. For example, here, one of the new ones is partnership with community colleges. We've got a partnership going. Mark and Tanya led this with Charlene Green, partnership with our community college system through UC Davis undergrad to UC Davis Medical School.
Great. We'll entertain one more question if you're willing. This is from Adesua Akatuamhen, who I hope I did not mispronounce the last name very badly. But it's a great question. What should be the standard DEI position responsibilities, staff, and resources?
I think that's a great question. And I feel like we don't know. I mean, we come out of this, right? We have this quote where like, no one knows what we're doing. No one knows how we're doing it. I think in an ideal argument, we don't even need one, because there should be something that changes. It happens everywhere in the institution. One of the challenges is when you create this in parallel, right? That being said, the current thinking that I have at the moment with my colleagues is the ideal DEI staff position and resources is what enables you to, I think what I'd said before was build community and do collective action. And frankly, it is collective action against your institution, and that's kind of what happens. So I feel like the ideal world is you have the funding and staffing and resources to go through this piece of identifying everyone across the board who is actually interested in racial justice, having the time and space and money to convene those people, pay them for their time, for their involvement, to then identify your pain points, to identify your power analysis of your school, who needs to change or what things need to change, and then what are going to be the best strategies for pushing that forward collectively. So I feel like that's what the work is going to be. As for staffing and budgeting, you may have to convince the leadership that you're going to be doing something else, but find a way to be able to deflect all these other non-performative tasks like putting out statements and fixing bad faculty to student interactions as examples of things that they do right now.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time for this, as I knew would be provocative, but also as I knew would be pragmatic discussion about directions that we need to go in the future to try to address these issues and really dismantle the structures that reemphasize and continue to perpetuate the racism that we see every day.
Thank you, Joanne. I really appreciate it. And I will throw out here something we can do our next talk is how we need to maybe get rid of the medical hierarchy.
Given that I do so much research about nursing and about low wage
Correct.
workers in
We're
healthcare.
never really going to end the institutional racism in medicine until we also get rid of that piece.
Yep. We've got work to do together, Michelle.
All right. Thanks again.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I hope you enjoyed this month's Grand Rounds. We will be back in 2023 with a new set of speakers every month.
Thank you.